Now we will see how the definition process is like for those business needs and how you will create that model in GeneXus. First, we will define the logical model, thinking of the different objects, for example, the transaction object and the procedure object, so that you can define the logic model of your e-banking application. To create the logics, you will see that we have designed in a folder in GeneXus using different objects, those entities that have been um, decided to be requirements for the business by the client. In this case, we use, for instance, the transaction object to define the user entity. We're defining the information that will be stored for each user's registry. And additionally, we created another object for transactions that is called credit card type. And we store the information of all the credit card varieties that you have offered by the bank to their users. What's important about the use of transactions is that we can link different attributes in different transactions, bringing our model to life. And you can see that this is a credit card transaction. So as part of the information that you have defined, that is inside a credit card, you see that we are using different attributes that correspond to other transactions. You can see that this is shown by the arrows when you define your transaction. In the case of credit cards, which are an entity that represent an instance, for example, a credit card that was granted to a user, you see that the user's ID and the credit card type ID is selected. So in this way, we will begin to build the logic model in our systems. We can make this even more complex by defining some entities that involve different actors, such as, for example, transfers, where you have an account that is making a transfer to another account. You see that this is a new definition level than the one that we use to bring this requirement to life. Now that we saw how we defined the logic model, what we can do is we can apply certain business rules that all these entities that we have defined will have to follow. Let's see how we can do this from GeneXus. Here we have the web application. We are logged in as administrators in the back office. And what we're going to do is we will create a transfer. We will make a transfer where we will give a concept or detail, and we will select the account that will be the one making the transfer, or the origin account for that transfer. In this case, we select, for example, John Smith as a user who owns an account with a balance of 3,480, and we select the destination account. So John Smith is going to transfer money to Rebecca Johnson's account. And we see that the first rule takes place. This is a business rule that it does not allow us to create the register because the amount transferred is 0. So now we will trigger another rule. We will have a rule that will verify that I'm not making a transfer for a sum that is higher than the one that I have in my account. So I will try to transfer, for instance, $5,000, and you see that you already have a notification telling you that you have insufficient funds to make that transfer. So I will make a transfer for an amount that is below the total balance of my account, and we will confirm it. You can see the transfer that was made for a sum of $2,000 with a concept that says test transfer. So now we go to the ID to see how we define that business rule in terms of the entity. If we go back to the ID, you will see that when you're working on the transfer transaction, you have a tab with rules where you are basically defining some rules that are important when it comes to creating new transactions. So we will be using a default rule that tells you that you have a certain value assigned to a certain attribute. In this case, to the transfer date, we are assigning the value by default of the date. Once we have defined an error rule, so for instance, if the amount of the transfer is 0, the user gets a message that tells them that they need to have a number that is higher than 0, or otherwise they will not be able to make the transfer. We have another rule that basically verifies that the amount to be transferred is an amount that is within the balance of the account holder. That is in the following line. So you're calling a procedure that will basically verify whether or not that rule is followed. And finally, you have the business rule that allows you to remove money, to take money from the sending account and to deposit that amount in the receiving account. What is important when defining these business rules in terms of the entity? That it doesn't really matter from which interface or which platform you're working with your transfers, these rules will always be validated, whether it's from a mobile application or from a web application. GeneXus will take care of the compliance of all these business rules that you have defined beforehand.